And welcome back to Richo. I said at the start of the show that euthanasia is an unpleasant debate. It's not something you like talking about. But nonetheless, every Australian finishes up having a discussion about it at some time in their lives. It's something that you just can't get away from. Everyone has had relatives who die badly, who die in pain and who die slowly. And so whether you believe in euthanasia or not, the topic will always come up. Tonight we've got three people to discuss it, all of whom I think have got legitimate views, because this is very hard to say in a debate like this. There's only one way to go. Dr Philip Nitschke is, I think, Australia's most famous euthanasia campaigner. And I said, or infamous, depending upon your point of view. He's in our Adelaide studio. And then Dr Andrew Alexander, a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Obviously he's in Melbourne. And Paul Russell, the boss of Hope, which is an anti-euthanasia group, is in our Sydney CBD studio. So welcome tonight, gentlemen. Dr Alexander, if I can start with you, given that you've got something to do with ethics, and this would have to be one of the great ethical debates of our time. For the medical profession in particular, this always seems, when they talk about their ethics committees, to be a huge problem. And they continually say to me, the doctors, that they'd rather not do this, that they just rather leave it go today. And my question is, the way it is today is that euthanasia occurs in our public hospitals every day by doctors, and it's not regulated, there are no laws, and they say just leave it alone. Is that the right ethical position?
Well, it's not as if there's no laws. There's obviously laws. It's just perhaps the problem is the laws aren't enforced, or they're not enforced for good reasons. Yeah, I mean, from the doctor's point of view, they might prefer that the status quo remains, where they can make decisions on a case-by-case basis, and it's basically, swept under the carpet. But I think from a public policy point of view, that's probably not the way to go. And like a lot of these things, there's obviously good reasons to bring things out in the open and either enforce a law or change the law and regulate it.
Well, it would be a very difficult law to enforce, would it not, Dr Nitschke? How do you know exactly what's happened? How can you can say when somebody doesn't wake up from getting some extra morphine, how are you going to say it was euthanasia or not?
Well, I mean, in the current situation, you're quite right. I mean, people don't know what's going on, and the idea of clarification and making some decent laws that people can understand would be a step in the right direction. Then, of course, you'd know who wanted to take access this choice, and it would be quite accountable. Currently, the situation is going on. People are getting more and more morphine. Doctors are saying, oh, that's got nothing to do with me, I'm just treating pain, and the person's dying. But we could open it up. We could make it quite clear. The patient could come along and say, I want to die now, and the right sort of drugs, which won't be morphine, they'll be the barbiturates, would be administered.
Well then, Paul Russell, can I turn to you? I mean, I think one of the things that's notable in this debate is that every time I look at a poll, it seems that a fairly big majority of Australians support the concept of euthanasia. They've never had an exact proposition put to them, but they support the concept. Does that worry you at all?
I must say it does, Graham. I'm particularly concerned that I think the question that is being asked doesn't actually reflect the truth about euthanasia. Yes, you might be right. There might be those who have some sympathy with the concept of it and perhaps feel compassionate towards those who are suffering. But the reality is, as I said, that those questions don't actually reflect the truth of euthanasia.
Well, what questions should we be asking?
I think really to gauge the public's opinion, we need to ask a series of questions that are qualified and instructive to give people a clear idea of what euthanasia is and what euthanasia isn't. For example, Philip earlier spoke about rising levels of morphine. Well, we know when a doctor's treating pain, and that is his prime aim, that is not euthanasia. But we also know that euthanasia is actually an active act with the intention of killing. And that's slightly different. Those are important distinctions. And I think if the public are more aware of what the distinctions are, and in fact what the history of euthanasia is around the world, I think we'd get a different story entirely.
But do you think doctors actually make those distinctions at the moment? Do you think that it's simply a matter of treating pain? Because there's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that doctors every single day make the decision to up the dose of whatever patients are getting because it's time.
Well, doctors know what they're doing for the most part, I imagine, and certainly they are protected and instructed by palliative care acts in every single state about just how far they can go and just exactly what they can do. In the circumstances of the current law, They know where the boundaries are. I fear that if we go down this path of euthanasia, that even the safeguards or supposed safeguards that are put in legislation will ultimately be ignored. And as we've seen in the Netherlands, as we've seen in Belgium, and to some degree in Oregon as well, where they have physician-assisted suicide, that it will become something of a free-for-all. That those distinctions will be blurred even further.
Okay, well, I'll get to that free-for-all with Dr. Nitsky in just a moment, but I wanted to return to Dr. Alexandria. Dr. Alexandria, can you see a way where you could actually codify this? Is it possible to do?
It's certainly possible to do. It's obviously been done in a number of jurisdictions, and I think the Dr. Nitsky's probably better informed than I am about the exact nature of that specification. But yeah, it's certainly possible to do.
And Dr. Nitsky, we're getting back to that exact question. Where it's been legislated in the world, and there aren't many places. I mean, let's face it, they're pretty few and far between. Does it work?
Well, I mean, when we were the first in the Northern Territory, and that was 15 years ago, but since then there's Oregon, Washington, Montana, there's Luxembourg, there's Belgium, there's Holland and Switzerland. So it's quite a few places since that time, and yes, can it be regulated? Well, they've done a pretty good job at it. And people are always talking about these excesses. If it was so excessively abused in places like Oregon or Holland, you'd think the populations in those places would do something about it, but they are very well wedded to their legislation. They're proud of it. They don't want it changed. They see themselves as on the right track, and so do I.
Well, then, I'd just like to go back to Paul Russell. Paul, that's the thing that I find it hard to answer. I've tried to look this up over the last few days. I can't find much evidence of riots in the streets in the places that Dr. Nitsky referred to about this. I just can't find some big public opposition. So, especially when it's a matter of life and death, and it's just ordinary families, ordinary folk everywhere that are affected by it. I mean, if they're not objecting, what's wrong with it?
Well, it's clearly a matter for the Dutch themselves as to what they do with their legislation. And I can't speak for them. I do know there is opposition in Holland, and I'm in touch with a lot of people there that oppose this quite strongly. But what I would say in answer to Dr. Nitsky's comment about the legislation working well, the 2005 report to the Dutch Parliament, when you look at the figures, show that 560 people in that year were euthanased without their consent. Now, that's a big worry, and that's where the social justice side of this argument comes in for me. Because, you know, we pride ourselves on this idea of informed consent, on this idea of giving choice. Well, for those 560 people, there were no choice. There was no choice. Choice is an illusion in those circumstances. So, you know, if there was one person in an Australian jurisdiction who died without giving consent, I'd say that's one person too many. And to be quite frank, if you look at the legislation all over the world, certainly in South Australia, where it's been debated repeatedly over the past few years, none of the legislative models that have come up have been able to protect the lost, the lonely, the vulnerable, the disabled, the frail-aged from acts of euthanasia without their consent. And that's why it's been voted down.
Well, Dr. Alexandra, obviously you would have looked at this many times. Is it possible to come up with laws that stop that sort of thing, that make sure there is a choice?
Well, I mean, it's obviously possible. I mean, we need to draw a few distinctions here, I think, between voluntary and involuntary or non-voluntary euthanasia. So it's obviously possible to have legislation that legalises voluntary euthanasia where there has to be informed consent. I'm not completely au fait with the situation in some of these other jurisdictions, but there's obviously lots of situations where people are incapable of giving consent and never will be capable of giving consent because they're, say, in vegetative states or they're in permanent comas and so on. And the question is then what happens to them? Does a decision have to be made on their behalf? And it's quite common in lots of other situations for decisions to be made on behalf of people who aren't capable of making decisions for themselves. And then the question obviously is just on what basis can those decisions be made?
Yeah, that's the obvious.
There's anything in principle difference with euthanasia and any other legislation.
But I think that's the obvious point here that disturbs me about the whole debate is that every day, every night in a public hospital somewhere in Australia today, a relative will talk to a doctor and somebody doesn't wake up the next morning. And I'm just wondering, ethically, how do you codify that?
Well, there obviously have to be, firstly, I mean, one kind of defence against abuse of that kind is that it has to be actually out in the open. The people have to register, notify what's happening. It's much more likely to be abused if it's all going on behind closed doors. The other point I make about this is that no doubt this sort of thing has always happened. It's just happening a lot more now in hospitals and at the hands of the medical profession, because basically most people now die in hospitals, and 100 years ago that just wasn't true. Most people died at home. So people will have always been making these decisions. It's just that now the medical profession is increasingly becoming involved in it, and it's becoming a matter of public policy rather than personal choice, private choice.
It is indeed. Look, we have to take a break and earn some quid here, if you don't mind. So we'll be back in just a few moments. Welcome back to Richo. Dr. Philip Nitsky, can I start with you? Let's say I'm a person with manic depression. I'm in one of my big downers, and I decide I want to have an assisted suicide. How do we guarantee, how do we guard against someone in a vulnerable position like that finishing up with an assisted suicide when maybe they woke up 2 days later, they'd say no?
Well, in all of the models that are operating around the world now, and the one we had in the Northern Territory, some form of psychiatric assessment is essential so that the person can be deemed to be of sound mind. Now, the person you described would not have passed that qualification, so they would not have been offered or been able to access the idea of an assisted suicide. And that is the comments that were made earlier about the idea of moribund people being helped to die every night in Australian hospitals. That's quite true, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with euthanasia legislation in Holland. The fact is it's more to do with modern medicine, and the fact is that people without their consent do get help to die, but it's got nothing to do with legislation. We need legislation to bring it out into the open so we can actually start to see exactly what's going to happen.
Well, I mean, obviously it happens every day, and that's the one thing that has irritated me about the debate. If something's happening, if it's a fact of life, in this case a fact of death, surely what we need to do is make sure there are laws to cover it, because at the moment there are none, and you wouldn't know what people get up to without them. But just returning to the point I made to you then, you had someone change their mind rather spectacularly, didn't you?
Well, we've had a few people change their mind. Who are we talking about?
No, there was a woman in the Northern Territory. I remember it pretty well. It actually done an ad for you, I think, and then recanted.
Right, okay. No, look, there have been people that have changed their minds. You've lost me on this particular individual, but people have changed their mind, and of course they should be able to. But the point about legislation is you've got to ask, and you've got to go through your cooling off period, and you've got to ask again on the day you die. This idea that you can somehow rather wax and wane and change your mind and then someone's going to come along and put you down is not part of the legislative models that we see in practice. So that's not the way it operates. Now, the fact that some people will come along and change their mind, okay, let them. But at the same time, bring in legislation, open it up and have some accountability. Currently, what we've got is completely the opposite of that. We don't know what's going on. We've got no good idea. And basically, it depends now who you know and whether you can get access to the best drugs.
Well, it's the case, I think, if I want to buy Nembutal, don't I go to Mexico or something and I can pick it up?
Yes, there's more Nembutal coming into Australia than there ever has been, to the point that the Australian Federal Police put out a statement a few weeks ago actually warning people of this practice. And that, of course, reflects the fact that elderly people are sick of waiting for politicians to change the laws, and so they're looking after themselves by getting these drugs.
Paul Russell, if I could turn to you. Given that if you put the sort of caveats that we've just been talking about into legislation, that you've got cooling off periods and all the rest of it, you can change your mind if you wish. You're of sane mind. You're an adult and everything else, and you're not depressed. You've been through a psychiatric test. What is wrong with it in that circumstance?
Well, I think we just need to have a look at reality, Graham. The Netherlands, that was their experience. That was their attempt. They have some safeguards. They have a certain number of steps or hoops, if you like, that people have to jump through before they can be euthanased. But still, we find that many people are being euthanased against their will. The Belgians looked at their neighbours and said, we're not going to go there. We're going to do something a bit better than that. We're going to make it tighter. We don't want to go down the Netherlands experience. Yet, within 8 years or 9 years since 2002, when they first began the experiment, The latest records show that about 32% of people that were euthanased there were euthanased without their consent. And, you know, in terms of what Dr. Niski was saying earlier about being able to formulate legislation, I'd have to say it's a utopian dream, because once you would know this yourself, Graham, once you put something into legislation, once it leaves the Parliament and the debating chamber, you know, you lose control of it. It is interpreted more widely perhaps than you ever thought it would be. Someone will say, hey, what about my rights? I'm not an aged person, I'm not dying, but I want to kill myself. I'm 22 years old, it's happened before. I want my rights as well. What are we going to say to people like that?
No.
Well, yes, hopefully.
I think that's the simple answer to that. No. I think as a basis for this, you'd have to have some form of terminal illness or some sort of extraordinary pain. I don't see how you could possibly say to somebody who walks in off the street and says, I don't feel like living, I want to die. I mean, I just don't think you'd ever say yes, would you?
Well, you would hope not, but it did happen in the Netherlands a number of occasions that I know of. And further to that, how do you define a terminal illness? You know, people have used terminology such as being in unbearable pain. Well, you know, being in unbearable pain for you might be something entirely different from me. And my wife says I'm a bit of a wuss. So you know,
You're not Robinson Crusoe.
How do we qualify all of that?
Well, Dr. Alexandra, how do we qualify that?
Well, I don't know. There's lots of
Can you
grey
define
areas
terminal illness in a legal sense?
Well, I'm not a doctor. I don't know how you define terminal illness, but I'd say the same thing about this. There's problems about defining death too. There's problems about defining lots of complicated things. That doesn't mean that we can't have legislation, and it doesn't mean that there won't be hard cases. It seems to me basically to be a red herring in this case. And the idea that, I mean, we've slipped from this thing about people being euthanased against their will to people being euthanased without giving their express consent. I mean, they're two completely different things.
Well, yeah, there's a whole lot of things. I mean, one of the arguments that often people who are anti-euthanasia talk about the killing of infants and, you know, just the involuntary euthanasia, which, you know, I always think you should be able to stop. But look, I wanted to chase you, Dr. Alexander, one other question, and that was, parliaments make these decisions, and parliaments are supposed to reflect the society in which that they represent. And yet, it seems to me when you look at the last time this came up in the federal parliament, I had a number of people talking to me at the time. That vote doesn't reflect what the polls say a great majority of Australians seem to believe.
That's true. I mean, there's obviously overwhelming popular support for euthanasia, but that was also true, by the way, of capital punishment. I think it's been one of the successes of Australian political leadership over the last, say, 30 or 40 years, that there's been a bipartisan opposition to capital punishment in Australia, and eventually public support fell into line. There's now most Australians don't support capital punishment. So although I think other things being equal, of course, Parliament should reflect the will of the people, I think there are some cases where Parliament should be leading popular opinion. Now, my own view is that in this case, there's probably sufficiently good reasons for Parliament to be supporting euthanasia, and my guess is that the reason they're not doing it is because that there's a well-organised vocal minority who are going to cause political pain, and that's not a sufficiently good reason for Parliament to refuse to bite the bullet on it.
Dr. Niski, you'd have to agree with that, wouldn't you? I mean, it just seems to me that if it goes back into Parliament tomorrow afternoon or next week or any time in the foreseeable future, it's not going to get up, is it?
No, I think that's right. I mean, the comments are correct. There is a well-organised group minority that are making it quite clear to politicians that if you support this, you're going to have a problem. It doesn't look good on your CV as a politician to be anti-church. And the idea of steering clear and running from this issue is so common with politicians. Doesn't matter that you've got 80% of people out there wanting the change. We're not seeing much evidence that it's about to happen. But in terms of politicians leading, well, let them try. The fact is that public opinion stays resoundingly in favour of this. The question that keeps getting asked is, if you're suffering of no hope of recovery, should you be able to get lawful help to die from a doctor? It's not that hard to understand, and most people want it.
Most people want it, and yet Parliament's refused to give it.
No.
Paul Russell, one last question on this question of numbers. Sorry, you want to say something?
Go ahead, Graham. Look, I'm surprised you're not defending your former colleagues in Parliament a bit more vociferously there.
I was disappointed in them, so I can't defend them.
I know that politicians are somewhere near used car salesmen in trust, but I have to tell you that it's just not true. I've been in and around parliaments for many, many years when these things have been debated, and I can tell you parliamentarians take it very, very seriously. And contrary to this opinion that it's all the God botherers in the world and people like me annoying them, the reality is that when you look at an issue, when you have to take it seriously, and when you're legislating for the state to sanction killing, which is effectively what we're doing, these politicians take it very, very seriously. And the more they look into it, the more they're convinced that it's not the way to go. They had a huge inquiry in 1998 in Tasmania where 5 of the 6 MPs on that panel were pro-euthanasia when they started, and 6 were against it.
I'm sorry,
in the end.
Dr. Russell, we do have to go, and I'd have to say we've taken it pretty seriously tonight. I know parliamentarians do. It's one of the most difficult issues, and I want to thank the 3 of you. It's not something that's going to be resolved, I suspect, in my lifetime, but eventually it'll have to. I don't think I'll be getting an assisted suicide. Like all of us, we'll have to wait. Thank you very much, and
Thank
good
you.
night from Richard.
Thank you.